In April of 1851, Alfred C. Hobbs boarded the steamship Washington bound for Southampton, England. His official duty was to sell the New York City-based company Day and Newell's newest product, the parautopic lock, at a trade show, London's Great Exhibition. But Hobbs had something a bit more nefarious up his sleeve, or rather in a small trunk that accompanied him on the ship. In it sat a large assortment of picks, wrenches, rakes, and other slender tools. You see, Hobbs wasn't just trying to sell his locks, he was trying to prove that his competitors' locks were quite simply not good enough. He had the tools, skills, and charisma to do just that. Alfred Hobbs was about to launch the Great Lock Controversy of 1851. Of all the locks at the Great Exhibition in July of 1851, the detector was thought of as the top of the class. Patented in 1818 by Jeremiah Chubb, it had become the most widely used and prestigious lock throughout England. In fact, in 1823, Chubb was given the distinguished honor of being the sole supplier of locks for England's post offices and Her Majesty's prison service. By 1851, Chubb and Son and their detector lock was so highly respected that they were given the assignment of creating a special security display cage that housed the great Koh-i-Noor diamond, a 186-carat diamond that currently sits in the crown of King Charles, which is locked in the Tower of London. Numerous picklocks in London had made attempts of getting past the detector with no success. In one instance, a picklock who had been imprisoned was offered his freedom if he could figure out a way to pick the detector lock. He couldn't do it. What made the detector lock so difficult was that the lock had a built-in anti-lockpicking mechanism which, if triggered, would render the lock inoperable even if you had the key. This trap worked such that if you lifted one of the pins beyond what the key would have done, it triggered the lockdown mechanism. By this, you could also tell if someone had tried to pick the lock if your key suddenly stopped working. To get the lock to work again, a special regulating key was needed, which would reset the lock such that it could be opened once again with the normal key. The detector was thought to be in a lock class all to itself. That is, until Hobbs got to it. According to a report filed by Benji Johnson, an agent of the state of New York appointed to attend the Great Exhibition, Hobbs wasted very little time in proving that Chubb's locks were not impenetrable. As the report read, soon after the exhibition opened, Mr. A.C. Hobbs of New York, who had charge of the Day and Newell's locks, obtained one of Chubb's locks and opened it in the space of 10 or 15 minutes in the presence of several gentlemen. As one would imagine, this did not sit well with many of the Englishmen who were using the detector to lock away their homes and valuables. Most of all, it did not sit well with Chubb and Son. They thus challenged Hobbs to try something a tad more difficult, a Chubb's lock attached to an iron door of a vault in Westminster that was a depository of valuable papers. Hobbs sent out an invitation for them to come watch him pick. Gentlemen, an attempt will be made to open a lock of your manufactured on the door of a strong room. You are respectfully invited to be present and witness the operation. At approximately 11:35 a.m. in the front of the iron door in Westminster, Hobbs met his skeptical onlookers. The later account then read, he took out from his waistcoat 2 or 3 small and simple-looking tools, a description of which, for obvious reasons, we fear to give, and went to work. Within 25 minutes, he had the lock open with a sharp click. He had once again successfully picked a supposedly impenetrable Chubb lock. Witnesses, hardly believing their eyes, asked him to do it again, so he relocked the lock and picked it again, this time in 7 minutes and without the slightest injury to the lock or door. England's illusion of the security of their possessions had been shattered. After making his presence quite known at London's Great Exhibition, Hobbs continued his lockpicking tour in England. For instance, later that summer he picked the monster Brahma precision lock, which had never been picked since it was manufactured in 1790. This scared the Bank of England enough that they had all their locks swapped out for Day and Newell's. Dubbed by the newspaper the Great Lock Controversy, the London Times wrote, "We believed before the exhibition opened that we had the best locks in the world, but no longer after Hobbs' demonstrations." However, skeptics doubted Hobbs' ability, asking if the locks were picked properly, if he had cheated, or even if they hadn't seen it themselves, that it was all an urban myth. Even major publications, while admitting that Hobbs did do what was asked, doubted his skills. Said Banker's Magazine, "The results of the experiment has simply shown that under a combination of the most favorable circumstances and such as practically could never exist, Mr. Hobbs has opened the lock." So how did Hobbs acquire his prestigious lockpicking skills? Hobbs' father died when Hobbs was just 3 years old, so as soon as he could work, he did so to help support his family. Thus, at the age of 10, he began his professional career as a farmhand. He eventually moved to wood carving, carriage building, tinsmithing, and harness making. Around 1835, he earned an apprenticeship with a sandwich glass company, now a museum 60 miles outside of Boston, where he learned to make doorknobs and the locks that went with them. He soon also became very talented at picking those locks. He took those skills to Day & Newell and quickly became a very good salesman. After all, what's a better way to sell locks than to easily pick your competitors' locks in front of your potential customers? Before showcasing his talents to Britain in 1851, Hobbs picked his way across America. He hopped from town to town, calling on banks to challenge him to open their safes, all in the name of selling Day & Newell locks, of course, and sometimes for prize money. For instance, according to a story recounted in A History of the Old Town of Stratford on the City of Bridgeport, Connecticut, written in 1888, while on a job in Lancaster, PA, replacing locks at a bank in 1848, a cashier showed him a newspaper ad placed by a Mr. Woolbridge of Perth, Amboy, offering $500, about $11,000 today, to the person who could open the lock on the safe in the New York Merchants Exchange Reading Room, now the National City Bank building at 55 Wall Street, within 30 days. Hobbs proclaimed to the clerk, "This is my money," and left for New York right after finishing the job in Lancaster. Hobbs met his challenger in New York, and after parameters were set, 3 arbiters were to oversee. He must use instruments of his own, and if he was not able to open the lock, Hobbs would have to sign a certificate declaring the lock perfectly safe and recommend it to the public. Now, Woolbridge's lock was extremely cleverly designed. Besides having 479,001,600 possible arrangements of the pins, it was rigged such that if the bolt was pulled before the tumblers were perfectly set, anything in the lock would be seized and you'd be unable to remove it, thus making the lock impossible to pick at this point with tools stuck inside. So the picklock couldn't try to open the lock until he or she knew the tumblers were set just so. After everyone went home for the day, Hobbs was given access to the safe and began work on the lock at 9 p.m. In just 2.5 hours, he had figured out the correct setting for the pins and laced a thin metal wire into the lock to pull the bolt. Of course, he needed the arbiters to witness what he had done to get credit, so he waited until the following morning when they could be called. At 10 a.m. the next morning, Mr. Woodbridge, who Hobbs had requested attend him along with the arbitrators, found Hobbs standing in front of the safe with a crowd surrounding him. Again, from A History of the Old Town of Stratford and City of Bridgeport, Connecticut, Mr. Woodbridge came, and there being quite a crowd around, he called from a distance, "Hello, Mr. Hobbs, what is the trouble?" "There's something the matter with this lock," said Mr. Hobbs. "What is it?" said Mr. Woodbridge. Mr. Hobbs then, carefully moving the wire, pulled the door of the safe open and said, "Your lock won't keep the door shut."